I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. At my age, it's a tiring and thankless task. My hearing isn't what it used to be, and I try to spare my heart from unnecessary stress. I was simply walking down the corridor, slowly leaning my hand against the wall, as I did every morning. The house was still asleep, but not with that peaceful morning silence, but an anxious one, as if someone was holding their breath. The door was slightly ajar, just a little. I didn't even immediately realize that the voices were coming from there. They were muffled, cautious, like people who are sure that no one can hear them. I was about to walk past when I heard a phrase, a short one, said almost casually, "She's still alive." I stopped. Not from shock, from clarity. Such words don't frighten you when you've lived a long life. They simply fall into place, like the last piece in a complex puzzle. I didn't move closer. I didn't pretend I hadn't heard. I just stood and listened further, because I knew sometimes the truth chooses its own moment to reveal itself. They spoke quietly, without anger, without emotion, like discussing the weather or a shopping list. And that was the hardest part. There was no fear for me in those words. No concern. There was expectation. As if my life had become a deadline that someone was checking by the clock. I felt a coldness slowly rising from the floor. Not physical, internal. I suddenly understood clearly that in this house they were talking about me, as if I were almost gone. As if I were a matter of time. And if so, then I had lived too long without asking the questions that should have been asked a long time ago. I quietly moved away from the door. Not because I was afraid of being seen. I simply needed space for that phrase to settle inside me. I returned to my room and sat down on the edge of the bed. My heart was beating steadily. Old age makes such moments especially strange. You no longer panic, but you don't brush it off either. You simply accept it. I thought about how often people talk about the elderly in the third person, even when they are still here. How easily a person is turned into an expectation, into a pause, into not yet. And how rarely they consider that this not yet has ears, a memory, and a life that is still going on. At that moment, I understood the main thing. If I heard it now, it meant I was supposed to hear it. Not later. Not afterward. Now. Because after such words, there really is no turning back. You can pretend it didn't happen. You can continue to live quietly, gratefully, unnoticed. But then every morning would begin with that whisper behind the door. I got up and went to the window. The day was starting as usual. The sun was slowly rising. The courtyard was filling with sounds. The world didn't know that something inside this house had changed forever. And there was a strange comfort in that. The world continued to move on, which meant I could too. I didn't yet know what I would do. I didn't know who I would trust, and who I would stop trusting. But I knew one thing. After those words, I could no longer be just a background. I couldn't pretend I didn't hear anything. Because the phrase, "she's still alive," sounds completely different when you are that she. And at that very moment, sitting by the window, I clearly thought for the first time, if I've already been mentally buried, then it's time to remind everyone that I'm still here. And that life is not what is expected behind the door, but what happens on this side. I've long noticed, the quietest things turn out to be the most important. Sometimes a small surprise changes the mood of the whole day. If you suddenly feel like it, it's waiting for you in the description. After that phrase, the house began to sound different. I couldn't explain it in words, but I felt it with my body. The floorboards no longer just creaked, they seemed to be issuing a warning. The curtains didn't just sway, they concealed something. Even the clock on the wall ticked with a different intonation, as if it were counting down not time, but someone's patience. I tried to behave as usual. At my age, sudden changes always arouse suspicion. I brewed tea, placed the cup on the table, opened the kitchen window to let in the morning air. Everything was the same as yesterday. But something inside me wasn't returning to its usual place. The phrase I'd overheard behind the door wouldn't go away. It wasn't swirling in my head. It was simply standing there, like an object that couldn't be moved or thrown away. I started noticing little things that I had previously dismissed as fatigue or coincidence. How conversations would stop when I entered the room. How glances lingered on me longer than usual, but not with warmth, with assessment. How sometimes I was told to rest, even when I wasn't tired. Care easily masks control if you don't ask questions for a long time. I caught myself listening intently, not out of curiosity, out of caution. Old age teaches you. If people start discussing you without you present, it means a decision has already been made somewhere. And the quieter it is around you, the more important it is not to miss the sound that will explain everything. That day I sat in my room for a long time. I sat and remembered. Not the distant past, the recent past. Moments when I wasn't invited to discussions. When they said later, but later never came. When decisions were made quickly, and I was informed of them calmly, as if it had nothing to do with me. Back then I thought, it's just convenience. Now I understood. It was a rehearsal. I went to the wardrobe and opened it. My things were in place, but neatly shifted. Space had been freed up. Not for me. This movement was almost imperceptible, but too deliberate to be accidental. I closed the door and sat on the bed. My heart was beating steadily. I wasn't panicking. I was analyzing. Panic is a luxury of the young. The elderly retain clarity. I thought about the word alive. It sounded as if it were followed by for now, like a temporary state. Like a pause before the inevitable. And I suddenly understood clearly. I had already been mentally moved into a different category. Not a person, but a circumstance. Not a participant, but an expectation. And that was scarier than any rudeness. At dinner, they talked about plans. About someone's business, someone's trips. They didn't ask me anything. They simply left a place for me at the table. I ate slowly and listened. There was too much future and too little present in those conversations. My present. I suddenly felt like a guest in my own life. After dinner, I went outside. I needed space where I wouldn't be discussed in whispers. The air was cool but honest. It didn't make plans. I walked slowly, stopping, looking at people. They were all going about their business, unaware that in one house, an elderly woman had already begun to be considered a matter of time, not a person. And there was comfort in that ignorance. The world hadn't taken my place away from me. People were trying to take it away. I sat down on a bench and allowed myself to think aloud, quietly, almost silently. What exactly were they waiting for? What were they afraid of? And why had my life suddenly become a matter of convenience for them? The answers didn't come immediately. They formed slowly, like an old letter read in poor light. I understood that it wasn't about me as a person. It was about the fact that my presence interfered with someone's plans. And if so, then the words behind the door weren't an accident, but a symptom. A symptom that I had already been excluded from the future, leaving me only in the present, for a short time. In the evening, I returned home and heard the silence again. But now it was different. I no longer mistook it for peace. It was the silence of waiting. I walked past the door behind which the words had been spoken. It was closed, tightly, like closing a topic, not a room. I went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared into the darkness and thought about how strangely life is arranged. Sometimes a single accidental whisper says more than years of care. And if that whisper is heard, it cannot be forgotten. You can only respond. I didn't yet know what my answer would be, but I knew what it wouldn't be. I would no longer agree to be just for now, because I am alive, not according to someone else's schedule, but by my own right. I had long noticed that the quietest things turn out to be the most important. Sometimes a small surprise changes the mood of the whole day. If you suddenly feel like it, he's waiting for you in the description. After that night, I stopped rushing. Before, it seemed to me that if I moved slowly, life would pass me by. Now I understood the opposite. If you hurry, you might not notice how you've been erased from it. I lived cautiously, but attentively. I watched, listened, remembered. Not like someone who was offended, but like a person who finally decided to understand what was really happening to them. I started noticing patterns. Not big ones, small, almost imperceptible ones. Like how documents started appearing in the house more often. How conversations about the future took place without me, but in my presence. How the word later was used more and more often, and my name less and less. It was like a slow fading away. Not abrupt, almost gentle. Like erasing an old inscription from a blackboard, not wanting to spoil the surface. I took out my old notebook, the one where I used to write down recipes, phone numbers, random thoughts. I started writing down phrases in it. Not my own, other people's. The ones I heard in the corridor, in the kitchen, behind closed doors. I didn't draw conclusions. I simply recorded them. With age, you understand, what is written down ceases to be a ghost. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was behaving strangely, that maybe all this was the result of fatigue, loneliness, excessive sensitivity. I caught myself having these doubts and didn't push them away. I allowed them to be. But every time the doubt became too persistent, I returned to that phrase. She's still alive. And the doubt receded. Because such words are not said by chance. I remembered conversations from the past, old, almost forgotten ones, about how someday we'll have to decide, about how we are all mortal. These phrases used to seem philosophical. Now they had acquired context. I understood. The discussion of my life began long before that morning. I just heard it for the first time. I began to feel a strange duality. On the one hand, pain was rising within me, not from resentment, but from the realization that I was already mentally gone. On the other hand, a calmness was growing, because if the truth had finally revealed itself, then there was no longer any need to pretend that everything was fine. I decided to check what I had been putting off for a long time. The documents, the papers, those very things I had previously dismissed, considering them secondary. I took them out slowly, carefully, as if I were touching not paper, but my own history. I read lines I had previously skipped, and in them I found not a threat, but structure. A world where words have meaning. I wasn't looking for evidence against anyone. I was looking for support for myself. I needed to understand. If tomorrow someone says that everything is already decided for me, what do I have? The answers didn't come immediately, but they did come. And with each new answer, things became a little calmer inside. I was no longer afraid to hear something new. On the contrary, I found myself wanting clarity, even if it would be unpleasant. At my age, uncertainty is more tiring than the truth. The truth at least allows you to breathe evenly. In the evenings, I sat by the window and thought about how strangely human dignity is structured. You can ignore it for years, and then suddenly realize that you can't live without it. I had considered for too long that the main thing was not to interfere. Now I understood. If your presence is perceived as an obstacle, then you have been silent for too long. I began to prepare. Not for a scandal. Not for a confrontation. For a conversation. A calm, precise conversation where every word would carry weight. I knew this conversation would happen, not because I wanted it, but because it had already begun without me. Sometimes at night, I would wake up and listen to the house. It no longer seemed like home to me, but it hadn't become alien either. It was a space in which I could still act, and this knowledge gave me strength. I was no longer the one being talked about behind closed doors. I was becoming the one who would open them myself. I understood. There really is no turning back. Not because I'm being pushed out, but because I can no longer live pretending not to hear. What has been heard cannot be unheard. You can only accept it or betray yourself. I chose the former. And as I closed the notebook with my entries, I knew the next chapter of my life would not be written in whispers, even if my voice remains quiet. I had known for a long time that this conversation would happen, not because I planned it, but because it was slowly approaching on its own, like a train you hear long before it arrives at the platform. In old age, such things are felt especially clearly. You no longer run towards them or hide from them. You simply wait for their time to come. The day was ordinary. Too ordinary to be accidental. I brewed tea, set out the cups, opened the window. Everything looked peaceful, almost cozy. And that's what made me brace myself. Often the most important conversations don't happen against a backdrop of drama, but amidst familiar objects that then forever remember every word. I didn't call anyone specifically. I didn't set a time. I simply stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. I sat there unhurriedly, allowing the silence to thicken. People themselves sense when something needs to be said. They enter cautiously, as if into a room with the lights off. When we were left alone at the table, I didn't start right away. I allowed a pause to happen. At my age, a pause is not a sign of weakness. It's a form of strength. I looked at my hands, at the tabletop, at the light falling from the window, and felt the words inside me arranging themselves in order. Not accusatory, not complaining, honest. I said that I had overheard the conversation. I didn't repeat the phrase immediately. I simply said, I overheard it, and that was enough. I saw how their shoulders tensed, how their gaze briefly shifted away. People always recognize the truth before it's spoken aloud. When I finally uttered those words, "She's still alive," they hung in the air. Not as an accusation, as a fact. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke very quietly. But in the silence of the kitchen, every word sounded distinctly, like a drop in a glass. They began to explain. Carefully. Too carefully. They said I misunderstood, that it wasn't about me, that I took it too personally. These explanations were familiar. I'd heard them for years, only before they concerned other things. Now, myself. I listened without interrupting. I let their words finish. And then I said what I had been preparing for a long time. That I didn't demand an apology. That I didn't need an excuse. I needed clarity. Because living knowing that you're being discussed as a matter of course is impossible. Not at my age. Not in my right mind. I said that I felt like I was gradually being erased from the future. Not from life, from the decisions. And that the phrase I overheard behind the door wasn't the cause, but the confirmation. Confirmation that conversations about me had been going on without me for a long time. I didn't cry. The tears didn't come. Sometimes they're not needed. Sometimes it's enough that your voice remains steady. I saw how the people opposite me were taken aback. They expected emotions, reproaches, resentment, but not calm firmness. That always frightens more. They started talking about care again, about how we're thinking of you. And that's when I interrupted for the first time. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but I interrupted. I said that care that deprives a person of their voice ceases to be care. It becomes control. And that I no longer agree to that. These words didn't come easily to me. Not because I doubted them, but because I had lived differently for so long. Saying I don't agree in old age means crossing out an entire system of habits. But when I said it, something inside me let go. As if I had finally taken my rightful place. The conversation didn't last long. Not because everything had been said, but because there was nothing more to say at that moment. I didn't demand solutions. I didn't set conditions. I simply drew a line. And that line wasn't between me and them, it was between the past and the present. When I left the kitchen, I didn't feel heavy or light. I felt even, like after a long journey, when you finally reach your destination, even if you don't know what will happen next. I returned to my room and closed the door. Not out of resentment, out of a need to be alone with myself. I sat on the bed and thought that this conversation could have happened earlier, many years ago. But then I wouldn't have been able to say all this. I wouldn't have had enough inner peace. Sometimes age is not a loss, but an accumulation of the strength to speak without shouting. I understood. This conversation wouldn't solve everything. Perhaps it would only complicate things. Perhaps there would be more steps ahead, documents, conversations with strangers in strict offices. But the main thing had already happened. I could no longer be discussed in the past tense while I was alive and could hear. That evening the house was especially quiet. But this silence no longer weighed on me. It was full. I went to bed and for the first time in a long time felt not anxiety, but confidence. Not in people, in myself. After that conversation, I felt neither relief nor victory. There was a different feeling, as if I had left a room where there had been a lack of air for a long time. Breathing became easier, but the weakness still lingered. Old age doesn't like sharp turns. It prefers gradualness. And yet I knew what had been said could not be taken back. The house behaved cautiously. People spoke to me more gently than before, but this gentleness was wary. That's how you talk to those who might no longer remain silent. I noticed glances that lingered longer than usual and pauses before words. This wasn't concern. It was a reassessment. I spent a lot of time alone, not because I was being avoided, but because I needed it. I sat by the window, listening to the day pass by, and thought about what had really happened. Not about the phrase overheard behind the door. That was just a spark. I thought about the years during which I had been gradually pushed out of the present, leaving only memories. Suddenly, I saw clearly. I wasn't just being discussed. I was already being allocated. My things, my habits, my space. All of it was being considered as something that would sooner or later become available. And the thought of this was painful but not humiliating, because now I was looking at it not from the inside but from the outside. I took out the documents, not in search of protection, in search of confirmation. Papers don't have emotions. They speak plainly, without hints. I read and understood that much had been decided as if I were already gone. Not formally, psychologically. And this explained everything. The whispers, the caution, and that very phrase, spoken almost thoughtlessly. I wasn't angry. Anger requires a lot of energy, and I was conserving mine. Instead, another feeling grew within me, clarity. I understood that I could no longer live in a house where my life was considered a temporary inconvenience. Even if everything looked fine on the surface, I started preparing. Not loudly, not demonstratively. I found out where to go, who to talk to, what steps were possible. I did it slowly, with pauses, allowing myself to get tired. I wasn't in a hurry. It was important for me not to win, but to preserve myself. Sometimes I was asked if everything was all right. I answered briefly, yes. Because order is not the absence of problems. It's understanding what you're going to do about them. And I had that understanding. I increasingly found myself thinking that the future no longer frightened me. Before, it seemed like something that would happen without me. Now I knew, even if it was short, it would be mine. Not discussed behind closed doors. Not planned in whispers. In the evening, when the house fell silent, I thought about the word alive. It no longer sounded like a postponement. It had become an affirmation. I am alive, therefore I have the right to a voice, to space, to a decision. And this right does not depend on anyone's convenience. I remembered myself many years ago. A woman who tried to be invisible so as not to be a bother, who believed that gratitude was a form of security. I didn't judge her. She did everything she knew how to do. But now I knew more. I understood. Only one last step remained. Not a conversation that had already happened. Not a guess that had taken shape. All that remained was to accept that there was truly no turning back. Not because I had been pushed away, but because I could no longer return to a state where my life was a subject of discussion without my participation. That night, I slept peacefully, deeply, without dreams. It was the sleep of a person who had finally stopped listening for footsteps outside the door, because the door was no longer a boundary between truth and silence. In the morning, I woke up with a feeling of completion. Not an ending, but readiness. I knew there would be an epilogue. Quiet. Unpretentious. The kind of ending that a return to oneself should have. Because when you hear she's still alive and you don't back down, you truly begin to live for real. After all, life didn't change drastically. In old age, things rarely change suddenly. Life doesn't like sudden movements, loud victories, or quick resolutions. But it knows the value of small, but irreversible shifts. Those that aren't immediately visible, but are felt every morning. The house remained the same. The same walls, the same windows, the same light falling on the floor at a certain hour. But inside this house, I was no longer a shadow. And this was felt not only by me. It was felt in the way people spoke to me. In the way they now paused before making a decision. In the way they stopped talking about me in the third person, even when they thought I couldn't hear. I didn't change outwardly. I still walked slowly, sometimes forgot why I entered a room, and still got tired by evening. Age hadn't disappeared, but something else had disappeared, the feeling that my life was already somewhere after, that it was an appendix to someone else's plans. Now I was living in the present again, and this present had my voice. I often remembered that moment behind the door, not with pain, but with gratitude, because, to be honest, I had felt this attitude for a long time. I just didn't want to name it. The phrase, "she's still alive," didn't bring new knowledge. It gave form to what was already in the air. Sometimes, a single word is enough to stop doubting your own feelings. I no longer listened to the house, not because it had become safer, but because I no longer needed to check if I was being talked about. Even if they were talking about me, it no longer held any power over me. I knew where the boundary was, and I knew I could redefine it again if needed. Loneliness had changed. Before, it was empty, like a room without furniture. Now, it was calm, like an evening where you don't expect any surprises. I learned to be with myself without anxiety, to sit in silence and not fill it with thoughts about what would be convenient for someone else. This turned out to be unexpectedly pleasant. I noticed that I had become more attentive to small things, to how the light falls on the table, to the sounds of the morning, to my own breathing. In old age, such things become anchors. They remind you, you are here. You are alive. Not still, but simply alive. Sometimes I was asked questions, cautious ones, not always sincere. I answered calmly, without revealing everything, without making excuses. I understood that I wasn't obligated to explain every feeling, every decision. Explanations are a luxury that people often give to those who are not ready to accept a simple, "I decided so." I was no longer afraid of conflicts, not because I wanted them, but because I understood that the absence of conflict doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just a postponement. And I no longer lived in a state of waiting, neither for an end, nor for a resolution, nor for someone's convenient moment. I thought about how often elderly people are gradually erased not from life itself, but from conversations about it. First, they stop asking questions. Then they stop taking them into account. Then they simply check, still alive. And this is not done out of cruelty, more often out of fear. Fear of someone else's vulnerability, of their own future weakness. I understood this, but understanding no longer required a sacrifice on my part. I learned to say I am, not out loud, inside. And that was enough. The world didn't collapse. No one was harmed. But I stopped disappearing. Sometimes I caught myself smiling for no reason, simply because the day was passing and I was in it, because I didn't need to prove that I deserved a place. I already occupied it, quietly perhaps, not in the foreground, but rightfully so. I no longer returned in my thoughts to what I could have done before. These thoughts come, but I don't dwell on them. The past doesn't like to be rewritten. It likes to be accepted. I accepted it, and I moved on at my own pace. If someone were to ask me now what was the most important thing in this story, I wouldn't say the conversation or the phrase behind the door. I would say, the moment I stopped agreeing to be still. Because in that word there is too much expectation of the end and too little respect for the present. I am alive. Not for now. Not yet. Simply alive. And that's enough to ensure that there's truly no turning back.